Chapter 35, Part 2, The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions Continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2 by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman, Chapter 35, Part 2, The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions Continued. With regard to the tempo markings, a distinction exists between the earlier and the later works. In the former, Bach usually indicates the tempo. In the latter, he only does this occasionally, even in the cantatas, the parts of which he has carefully revised. Footnote. Among the cantatas partly or wholly provided with tempo indications, we may mention Gottes Zeit, number 106, Du wahre Gott und Davidchen, number 23, Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, number 61, Weinen klagen, number 12, Selig ist der Mann, number 57, Süßer Trost, number 151, and Mach dich mein Geist bereit, number 115. The tempi are also marked in the B minor Mass and many of the secular cantatas. End footnote. The appropriate tempo for a movement is, as a rule, not hard to find if we examine the text and nature of the music. The old tempi were generally rather too slow, which did some injustice to the more passionate of Bach's movements. Even today, many arias ought to be taken much more quickly than they usually are. A hurried tempo, however, must always be avoided. It should be noted how simple the vocal part is in certain movements of a passionate character. This seems to indicate that Bach wishes them to be taken quickly. Footnote. Examples of a very quick tempo will be found in the duet Lass Schiel keine Leiden from Agle dich, o Schiel nicht, number 186, and the arias O Mensch erret deine Schiel from O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort, number 20, and Wirf mein Herz, wirf dich doch from Mein Gott, wie lang, ach lang, number 155. The tempi of the Passions, the B minor Mass, and the Magnificat have been discussed in connection with the analyses of these works. Sometimes the problem of the proper tempo for a movement can only be solved by long experiment. Some movements, again, are enigmas. We shall never be quite clear as to the tempo they require. We may formulate the general principle that the tempo is correct when the details and the ensemble are equally perceptible and equally effective. Here again, as in the clavier and organ works, we must remember that the hearer who is listening to a work of Bach's for the first time often feels a moderate tempo to be a quick one if the modulations are very rich and the contrapuntal writing very complicated. The real difficulty in Bach's music lies not in choosing the tempo but in maintaining it. No one who knows the scores of the cantatas can doubt that Bach demands great elasticity in the tempo, the unity of which, however, must not be impaired. If the hearer perceives the nuances too clearly, he at once gets an impression of unsteadiness and a lack of rhythm. Our singers especially have not sufficiently realized this as yet. Otherwise, their performances would be more frequently satisfactory on the rhythmical side than they are at present. They are particularly at fault in their treatment of the cadences. They draw them out to excessive length and insist too much on even the most unimportant transitional cadences, which results in the arias being torn into separate fragments. The hearer with a sense of rhythm is nervously affected by this. As soon as he scents a cadence coming from afar, he realizes that the tempo will infallibly be slackened, that there will be a discrepancy between the voice and the accompanying instruments, that the orchestra will try to get back to the original tempo in the interludes, and that at the next cadence the game will begin all over again and be repeated 6 or 7 times before the aria comes to an end. The art of transition, of which Wagner speaks in one place, should be the ideal that every Bach singer should keep before him with regard to the tempo. Much will be attained if we can first of all get rid of the mistaken notion that every cadence must be taken in a slower tempo. The next thing desirable is that where rallentandi seem called for in the cadences, they should be applied circumspectly and with moderation. The ensemble of singer and orchestra should never be in the slightest degree impaired. Many rallentandi that seem possible from the point of view of the vocal part are impossible to the orchestra. In this respect, Bach's arias differ from those of the Italians. The orchestra with him does not merely accompany the singer, it is a separate entity. It cannot bow to the caprices of the singers. These must realize that they have to declaim their part expressively to a symphonic orchestral movement, and that the tempo must not vary very much, the effect being rather obtained by the finest nuances of tempo and rhythm. The tempo can be perceptibly varied where the verbal sense requires it. An excellent example of this is the soprano aria Ich folge dir gleichfalls in the St. John Passion. Here the usual rallentandi are wrong, as they negate the joyous urgency of the music. The only justifiable rallentandi are those required by the words Hör nicht auf, selbst an mir zu sehen, zu schreiben, zu bitten. Cease not to draw near to me and pray. The music here depicting the effort of bringing back, but to overdo this rallentando in the least is to endanger the effect of the aria. In Bach's arias it is advisable not to carry a rallentando through to the end, but to lead imperceptibly into the normal tempo again at the conclusion of the cadence, so that when the orchestra enters with the interlude, it has not to fall abruptly into another tempo. Practically, these considerations all amount to this, that the customary stereotyped rallentandi in Bach's music are bad, and that only those are justifiable that proceed from proper reflection upon the musical and poetical nature of the work. This implies that the conductor and the singer should come to an understanding as to the tempo and its variations, and the general conception of the work before, not at, the rehearsal. They must not shrink from long rehearsals and much correspondence. Both will bear rich fruit. Every thoughtful conductor and singer knows to his sorrow that one of the greatest obstacles to a good performance of a Bach cantata or passion is the too limited time devoted to the rehearsal of the solos. Our singers probably sin most against Bach's tempi in the recitatives. They take them much too slowly and with expression in the bad sense of the term, slowing down at each word that they wish to throw into relief, and introducing rallentandi in the cadences at the end of the subordinate sections, so that the hearer gets the impression only of a series of fragments, not of a connected whole. But if the singer aims simply at reproducing the verbal period as Bach has written it, he instinctively avoids any dragging, indulges in no senseless rallentandi, and tries to make his effort chiefly by means of the declamatory prominence of the most characteristic words. This or that section must be sung in a special tempo only when the sense of the text demands it, and in these cases the art of transition must be called into play so as to preserve the general unity of the tempo. No improvement in the delivery of the recitatives is to be looked for until our singers see clearly that they must not so much be sung as spoken with a certain musical feeling. How far the average singer is from this ideal as yet may be seen from the way he renders the recitatives in the Passions. His drawling mode of delivery often prolongs the performance by almost half an hour, but that is the least evil he works. Far worse than this is the fact that he is always depicting instead of narrating, wearies the audience with his false pathos, and neutralizes the effect of the glorious occasional passages in which Bach has given the evangelist a situation to paint. It would be a good thing if our evangelists would now and then recite from memory the story of the Passion. This would save them from many of the stereotyped errors in the delivery of Bach's recitative. The ultimate reason for the unsatisfactory performance of the part of the evangelist is very often the fact that the singer does not know the story of the Passion by heart. If Bach employs two themes in a movement, the artistic problem is to ensure to each its proper tempo without destroying the unity of the general tempo. The charm and the difficulty of this problem may be realized from a study of the first chorus of Ihr werdet weinen und heulen, number 103. There are many choruses in which Bach has expressly marked more tempi than one. Footnote. For example, the first choruses of Der Himmel lacht, die Erde jubilieret, number 31, Allegro, Adagio, Allegro, and Jesu nun sei gepreiset, number 41, in which Bach has marked the two middle sections, Adagio and Presto. In the choruses of his youthful works he almost always prescribes more than one tempo, as in these cantatas he is specially bent on composing the text line by line. In the analysis of the B minor Mass, examples are given in which the tempo of a movement is the product of a contest between two different motives. End footnote. It goes without saying that the middle section of the choruses and arias should be taken a shade faster or slower than the main sections, conformably to the sense of them. It is certain also that we can allot a special tempo to this or that segment of a passage. In the final chorus of Christen adstet diesen Tag, number 63, Bach himself has marked the words aber niemals lass gesgessen, Adagio. Markings of this kind, however, give no warrant for the capricious rallentandi merely designed for effect, by which certain conductors think they lend an added interest to Bach's music even in the chorales. Where Bach has sharply contrasted two motives in obedience to the poetic idea, it would be wrong to tone down the antithesis by passing gradually from the one tempo to the other. In the final aria with chorus of the cantata Halt im Gedächtnis Jesum Christ, number 67, a rallentado in the concluding bars of the passages that are constructed on the tumult motive must necessarily weaken the effect of the entry of the peace motive in the wind instruments. Even a diminuendo is out of place here. The more abrupt the transition is, the better. The instrumental basses must still give out the last bar of their tumult motive forte, even after the wind have entered piano. In the antiphonal cries again of the chorus Vol uns and O Herr, there should be no gradual mediation between the two tempi. The question of ornaments presents no special difficulty with regard to the cantatas and passions, since Bach almost always adopted the principle of writing out in full the complicated or even the simple ornaments. The signs he employs are to be interpreted in the light of the general principles laid down by Emmanuel, Quantz, and Turk on this subject. Footnote. See the detailed exposition of Bach's ornamentation in Volume 1. Rust discusses the ornaments of the cantatas in particular in the preface to BG 7. End footnote. As a rule, the trills are taken too quickly and irregularly. Our instrumentalists find a strange difficulty in entering into the spirit of Bach's style. It would be as well if the conductors would write out the signs in full in the orchestral parts. This would at any rate ensure a certain uniformity in the performance, which at present is sadly lacking, in spite of all explanation. Too much importance cannot be attached to a simple and quiet rendering of the trills. The following mode of realization may be suggested for the trills in the bass accompaniment to the aria Mein teurer Heiland in the St. John's Passion. Very often the context shows that the trill is best realized as a simple prautrille. An example may be seen in the oboe duet in the aria Sehet Jesu hat die Hand in the St. Matthew Passion. As many of the trills that Bach has marked are barely possible or quite impossible on the woodwind of today, and must have been even more so on the imperfect instruments of that period, Rust conjectured that the sign T or TR in these cases signified a kind of tenuto. This hypothesis can hardly be maintained. On closer examination, we get the impression that by the trill sign, Bach very frequently intended the single or double prautrille. In any case, the acceptance of this view might solve many difficulties. As regards the realization of the ornaments in the violin solo of the aria Erbarm dich in the St. Matthew Passion, it is first of all to be observed that the opening bars, according to the score and the parts, are not written, but since in the vocal part of the aria Was willst du dich mein Geist entsetzen from Liebster Gott wann werd ich sterben, number 8, the score has the sign and the voice part has the small notes. This realization of the sign may probably be regarded as authentic. Footnote. The BG editors have made the mistake of printing the realization in the text and the authentic sign in the preface instead of vice versa. In the aria Ach schlafig Ziel from Mach dich mein Geist bereit, number 115, and in other places, the BG edition rightly prints end footnote. The only question is whether Bach meant this slur to be part of the beat or to be regarded as a portamento outside the beat, between the F sharp and the D. The former is the more natural, but in the later part of the solo we meet with passages of this kind, in which the slur is written out. It is therefore a probable assumption, and one that has been put forward by connoisseurs, that Bach's notation in the opening bar implies another kind of slur not included in the beat. Footnote. Stockhausen, for example, held that the Bach slur must not always be included in the beat. Whether this opinion can be historically justified is doubtful. End footnote. There ought to be little difficulty in coming to an agreement as to the difference between the long and the short Vorschlag in this movement. The long Vorschlag are merely those that come before a dotted or undotted crotchet. All the rest are short. It goes without saying that in each case the accent falls on the small note of the Vorschlag. The appoggiatura, in the narrower sense of the term, gives unnecessary trouble to inexperienced singers. It is well known that in the vocal cadence Bach and his contemporaries did not write the falling second or the falling fourth as such, but wrote the final note twice, or the equivalent of twice. The following recitative in the St. Matthew Passion
Dreimal verleugnen,
must therefore be sung thus,
dreimal verleugnen,
and the following passage
nicht alle seid,
thus.
nicht alle seid.
This method of notation, in which, as in the Hebrew krekitib, we have to read something else than what is written, is explained by the reluctance of the old musicians to write out retardations in full. For the same reason, they wrote the Vorschlag thus, instead of thus. The laws of euphony were not extended to the I. The appoggiatura in the narrower sense is therefore simply a matter of the three Vorschlag involved in a vocal cadence. It was not noted in the ordinary way, but omitted altogether, in order that the organist or cembalist who had the voice part written out partially or in full above his figured bass, might not be put out by the retardation when he came to play his final chord. The terrors that this method of notation has for the laity vanish as soon as the reason for it is explained. It should be observed that nowadays it is not the custom to take every interval of a third in a vocal cadence, as an appoggiatura, by the mediation of the second. Julius Stockhausen, for example, very often disregarded the appoggiatura in a transitional cadence. Footnote. I owe this information to Herr Theodor Gerold, teacher of singing in Frankfurt, who was associated for many years with Stockhausen in his teaching work. End footnote. Many singers think it necessary to distinguish between two short verslages, an accented and an unaccented one, that is, one not taken in the beat. The authentic traditions of the 18th century seem to give no warrant for this view, and practical experiment will show that the short accented Vorschlag is always more natural in its effect than the unaccented one. It is still a matter for investigation whether the rule that the trill must begin with the subsidiary note holds good without exception in Bach's vocal music. The answer would probably be in the affirmative. In certain cases, the trill commencing with the principal note may have a charm of its own. As a rule, however, we should render it in the traditional way more frequently than is the custom now. It is hardly credible that Bach conceived the vocal trill differently from the instrumental. Every singer is bound to be pleased with the result when he takes the trill in the correct way. A particularly good method is to pause slightly on the principal note before beginning the trill with the subordinate note, and then gradually increase the tempo. Thus. On short notes, the sign TR mostly indicates only a pralltriller or a double pralltriller. For the dynamics of Bach's vocal music, the following works may be recommended for study. The secular cantatas Schleicht spielen die Wellen, BG 20, and O Holder Tag, BG 29, and the church cantatas Ach ich sehe jetzt, da ich zur Hochzeit gehe, number 162, Herr und Mund und Tat und Leben, number 147, Mein liebster Jesu ist verloren, number 154, Schauet doch und sehet, number 46, Herr gehe nicht ins Gericht, number 105, Liebster Gott, wann werd ich sterben, number 8, Ich bin vergnügt mit meinem Glücke, number 84, Christus, der ist mein Leben, number 95, Erfreut euch, ihr Herzen, number 66, Am Abend aber desselbigen Sabbats, number 42, Es wartet alles auf dich, number 187, Süßer Trost, mein Jesus kommt, number 151, Liebster Jesu, mein Verlangen, number 32, Ich elender Mensch, number 48, Ich freus mich in dir, number 133, Gelobet seist du, number 91, Das neugeborn Kinderlein, number 122. Among these movements are some in which Bach distributes forte, piano, and pianissimo in the subtlest way. For example, the first chorus of Das neugeborn Kinderlein, number 122, and the arias in Ich freu mich in dir, number 133, and Es wartet alles auf dich, number 187. As a rule, however, he is content with simple alternations of forte and piano. In the majority of the arias, the nuances mean very little, since the piano in the orchestral parts merely indicates the entry of the voice. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to think that Bach wished for no more nuances than he has usually marked. Proof to the contrary may be had in the movements which he has liberally sprinkled with forte, piano, and pianissimo. Moreover, we must always remember that he revised his parts only for his personal use, not for publication or for performances by other people. Footnote. The scores contain no indication for phrasing and no dynamic marks. Even the figuring of the continuo is omitted. How Bach marked the parts when it was a case of performance by someone else may be seen from the Kyrie and Gloria of the B minor Mass. The phrasing is indicated in the most precise way, while the dynamics are merely suggested. End footnote. He relied principally on verbal directions. Nor must we forget that singers and players, being constantly engaged in performing his works under his own direction, were intimately acquainted with his intentions, and would do the right thing of their own accord. These considerations determine our own course of action with regard to the parts in a performance. Whatever authentic marking exists must be attended to, but beyond this we can venture upon many things which must not be regarded as unauthorized, though they are not written in the parts, for they correspond to what Bach would tell his players by word of mouth. The parts must accordingly be elucidated and explained. The nuances that Bach has marked must be carried out, as in the clavier works and the Brandenburg concertos, with a certain abruptness. He loves the immediate antithesis of forte and piano. Generally speaking, he does not provide for the transition of one into the other by means of a diminuendo or crescendo. This is especially true with regard to the arias. The orchestral preludes and interludes must be played in a solid forte. At the entry of the voice, the instrument suddenly pass into piano. This abrupt transition cannot be successfully managed at the first attempt. Some practice in it is required. No conductor, however, will regret making the attempt to get his orchestra to enter into the spirit of the old tradition. Moreover, this is the best way of weaning the instrumentalists from the false kind of rallentandi. It has the further advantage that a number of transitional bass figures that were formerly lost in the diminuendo now make their proper effect. Among the peculiarities of Bach's dynamics which can be studied in the parts that he has so carefully marked with nuances are the echo effects. He often introduces, by way of contrast, 2 or 3 pianissimo bars where it would not occur to us to do so. At the first glance, the device seems artificial and pedantic, but as many themes and passages are calculated on it, it is one of the most natural and most telling effects that we can introduce into the accompaniment of the arias. As has been already mentioned, the players in Bach's time probably rendered these passages by slackening the hairs of the bow. The curious change of timbre obtained in this way, unfortunately, cannot be obtained with the modern bow. Bach gives us no indications as to the nuances he employed in the arias after the entry of the voice. He would regard this as belonging to the province of correct declamation. He would certainly permit every crescendo and diminuendo that was needed to give expression to the words. All nuances, therefore, that have a natural musical or poetical justification may be regarded as not only permissible but necessary. From the character of Bach's music it is clear that nothing could be more odious to him than a lifeless delivery of an aria. The more dramatically it can be sung, the better. Even the purely lyrical movements in the cantatas gain in performance by the infusion of a certain inward vivacity. In proportion, however, as the singer attains to a more profound conception of the text, will he adopt a simple style of performance. Many an effect that he thought fine at first will come to seem bad and factious as he understands the music better. If the singer articulates clearly and declaims with natural feeling, and the instrumentalists, even when they are playing piano, put life into their phrasing and accentuation, the dynamic problem solves itself. It will be observed that in Bach the question is generally not one of long periods of crescendo and diminuendo, but of throwing single words into high relief, notwithstanding that examples can be adduced in which the guiding idea of the music has apparently been an increase or decrease of tone. Perhaps it is not superfluous to remind singers that it is always bad to force the voice in performing Bach. Good Bach singers are comparatively rare. The majority fail because they lack the necessary technical foundation. Their conception may be right, but their voices are not fully obedient to them. The often repeated opinion that Bach's works do not need the bel canto is utterly false. They need this, but something more as well. It would be well for every Bach singer to devote some time to acquiring the lightness that is aimed at in the Italian and French schools, for which an acquaintance with good Italian vocal music is indispensable. It must not be forgotten that Bach formed himself on the Italian style of singing and presupposes this in his music. Present-day singers, as a rule, perform it too heavily. To this external art of singing has to be added the other art of natural poetic declamation that is so necessary in German music. Bach's coloratura has really hardly anything in common with that of the Italians. It is not an end in itself, but the servant of the declamation, which makes it harder, not easier. The singer must be superior to every technical difficulty if he is to render the runs simply and with a certain naturalness that is indispensable to their proper effect, for they should not impress us as coloratura, but as a fine enunciation. In passages of this kind, a certain urgency of tempo is preferable to dragging. The directness of delivery that suits Bach's music so well really demands a perfect technique. Few of our singers, apparently, realize the mischief done by inappropriate crescendi, or they would not prolong so unnaturally and embellish as they do every sustained note, even the shortest. In Bach's arias and recitatives we should not be conscious of the art of singing as such, no matter how indispensable it may be. On the contrary, the singing should be fresh, ingenious, and youthful in the best sense of the word. It should not be forgotten that the parts were written, without exception, for boys and very young singers. Bach's style was naturally influenced by the fact that these were the only interpreters he had at his disposal. The feminine delicacy with which very many of our singers render the arias is therefore foreign to Bach's ideas and does harm to his music. It is to be hoped that a time will come when more attention will be paid than at present to the natural lightness of the boy's voice, and more use made of boy singers in performances of Bach. We shall then probably find that the current prejudice as to the inexpressiveness of a boy's singing is not justified. Has not every musician discovered from his own experience that his artistic sensibility developed in an extraordinary way from his 12th to his 15th year, and that later on he had to acquire afresh what at that time came naturally to him? Why should boys at that age merely play the piano well? Why should they not achieve something in the much more natural art of song? Every one who has studied Bach's scores carefully knows that there are many movements in them that can never be fully effective except with the freshness and the timbre of the boy's voice. Perhaps the day will come when we shall once more hear the soprano cantata Geauchzet Gott in allen Ländern, number 51, again sung by the fresh voice of a boy. That beautiful boys' voices are the ideal for the Bach choruses will not be disputed by anyone who has heard a good boys' choir in one of the cantatas. Schreck has shown, with the St. Thomas boys of today, what can be done with an ensemble of this kind. The advantages of the boys' choir are the natural ease of the voices in the higher register, the clarity of the timbre of the soprano and alto, and above all, the homogeneity of the voices as a whole. The glorious outlines of Bach's alto parts cannot be followed properly except in a boys' choir. The difficulties of getting boys to perform Bach must not be overrated. The easier cantatas can be given by any good college choir after careful rehearsal. Certain of the secular cantatas, such as Der Zufriedengestellt Eilers, seem to be written for a choir of this kind. Perhaps the practice of Bach's works will bring about a new era in the rather sorry state of singing in our high schools. The conductor who has a few good boys' voices in his choir should use them to support the women's voices. It cannot be too strongly urged that the cantus firmus of the chorales, even in the chorale arias, should always be sung by boys. Anyone who has heard boy sopranos in the introductory choruses of the chorale cantatas can hardly imagine them again without these. Not many voices are required. Half a dozen of them, together with the women's voices, are sufficient to bring out the melody in broad, plastic lines. Boys' voices are very effective, again, in the canti fermi of the final chorales. There need be no fear that they will impair the fineness of the expression here, as will be evident to anyone who makes the experiment rationally. On the contrary, it is a matter for wonder that we have been so long satisfied to have the chorale melodies sung by women's voices that lack the full, penetrating, objective tone that is here required. There is still considerable difference of opinion as to the best way of rendering the final chorales. One view is that they should be given a cappella, without the accompaniment for strings and oboes that Bach has indicated or presupposed, to which the flutes and even the bass may sometimes be added. It is urged that Bach's purpose was merely to support his rather inefficient singers, and that our large modern well-trained choirs can dispense with this assistance. It would be a pity if this view should gain ground. There is a great danger in the a cappella performance of the chorales by a large choir. It is very easy to achieve falsity by exaggerating the dynamic shadings. It is indisputable that a great effect can be made on an audience by 400 voices delivering one line of a chorale fortissimo and the next in a hardly audible pianissimo. But it is almost equally indisputable that this is not the right way. The simple and beautiful outlines of the chorale melody are lost in these mighty crescendi and decrescendi, the rallentandi that they almost of necessity bring with them, and the long holding of the fermate for the sake of effect. We lose the sense of the chorale as a whole and only perceive the fragments. What should we say if any other simple melody were sung by a chorus in the same coarsely effective style? Yet it is permitted in chorales which are not only simple, but full of piety. For these exaggerated nuances we should substitute a simple but impressive declamation, studiously avoiding anything like sentimentality or excitement. The choir should almost speak rather than sing, the dynamic shadings being obtained, as it were, within a gamut of a sharply defined recitation. Care should be had with regard to the endings of words and of sentences. The fermate should be no more than natural breath pauses, short or long as the sense of the line requires. This method will bring us nearer artistic truth than the present style. If after this the chorale does not affect the audience, it will at all events give it a deeper artistic conception of the nature of the sacred melody. In a performance of this kind, the instruments are neither a hindrance nor a superfluity, but a necessity. Footnote: the instruments must cooperate in places where they are not prescribed in the BG edition. If they are not indicated in the chorale, this simply means that the parts of the cantata are lost. Bach comparatively rarely marks the instrumentation of the final chorale in the score, and does not even take the trouble to write the text in there, often inserting no more than the first line. End of footnote. They afford a golden background for the declamation. They work out the melodic outlines and permit the voices to attend almost exclusively to the clear delivery of the text. It should be noted that the harmonies in Bach's chorale movements aim not so much at large dynamic effects as at bringing out separate words and syllables. The enunciation of our large choirs in pianissimo passages is often very defective, the audience hearing neither singing nor speaking, but only a confused murmur, which cannot be agreeable even to an uncritical hearer. These views must not be taken to mean that under no circumstances must the chorales be sung a cappella by large or small choirs. There are occasions when it would be wrong to throw away the opportunities thus afforded for a striking effect. Each case of the kind, however, should be able to show its own justification. For the rest, we should never approach the problem of the performance of Bach's music in a narrow-minded spirit. End of chapter 35, part 2. The performance of the cantatas and passions.